Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as listening skies. Let it resound loud as rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won.
Greetings. My name is Pamela Foster, and on behalf of the MLK Committee, I am excited to welcome you to the 29th celebration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We celebrate this day because Dr. King gave so much of himself. He worked diligently for civil rights, voting rights, economic equality, and for social justice. His leadership, actions, and speeches have opened the doors for many people and changed the life for so many people. That impact was not limited to African Americans. His courageous efforts and courageous conversations helped change the direction of our nation many years ago. His works continue to impact our political, educational, and civil rights arena today. To think, in 2022, African Americans still face so many inequalities. Both civil rights and voting rights are still a struggle for African Americans and other people of color. Dr. King was also a passionate advocate for education. He understood the importance of education in advancing the condition of minorities and in eliminating long-standing societal prejudices. He believed the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. In his words, education plus character, that is the goal of true education. And continuing with Dr. King's legacy regarding education, our committee raises funds to provide scholarships to young people in the Delaware County school districts who attend a four-year college or university. We thank you for your support and contributions that allow us to continue the long-standing tradition of granting scholarships. In closing, I hope this program will motivate you to be a person of action and that you will commit to continuing the great works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you. Sit back and enjoy the program.
Let us pray. O God, our eternal Father, thou in whose presence our soul take delight, you, O God, in whom we live, move, and have our being, we come this morning. First, to say thank you, God, for allowing us to see another day. God, thank you for your grace and your mercy that you have bestowed upon each and every one of us this morning, new this morning. God, we come this morning asking that you created us a new spirit, a spirit that calls us to create communities, peace, freedom, and justice for all. As we stand surrounded by mountains of love and valleys of hatred, in valleys of deep division and mistrust and violence. God, we ask that you lead us. Lead us, oh good shepherd, through that fear and that racism and the ignorance and the hatred, to be more like you. Help us that we may give ourselves over to be change agents of your love in our homes, in our churches, in our schools and universities, our organizations, starting with ourselves. God, as we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, let us remember that the work starts when this program ends. The work never ends, Lord. It's daily that we must fight for justice for all. It is daily that we must fight for peace in our community. It is daily that we must fight to keep his dream alive. And God, as we venture through this program, God, I ask that you use everyone that brings forth your word and his vision and speak of his life. Help us, God, to be more like you in this world of confusion. So God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, we beseech you to continue to lead us into your light. God of mercy and God of justice, we ask that you keep us forever in your path, we pray. It is in Christ's name that I pray. Amen.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 29th annual celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day for the city of Delaware here in Central Ohio. For 27 years, the citizens of Delaware gathered on the Ohio Wesleyan campus in the morning on this day to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And while celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. King, to be reminded of the work that remains, the work that has been passed to the next generation to continue the mission undertaken by Dr. King and those who were a part of his movement. And now for the second consecutive year, because of COVID, we are gathering in a virtual environment again to celebrate the legacy of Dr. King, but more importantly, to think about the mission that stands before us as we continue the important work of Dr. King. And so our theme this year is why we can't wait. Why it is so important to act with urgency, even in a time when a virus and other things have challenged us and have taken our energy and have distracted our attention. This morning we remember we cannot wait, and we remember why. Yesterday we had the opportunity to participate in a program that reminded us of the important role played by Ella Baker. Ella was one of the more senior members of the early years of the civil rights movement. She was born at the turn of the century. She played a key role in the early days of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. And as we had the opportunity to reflect upon her life, I was reminded of some things that she said that are important for us to consider today. And I was reminded of the role that she played in helping shape Dr. King's leadership and his movement. So I would like to share a couple of quotes from Ella Baker and follow each quote with something Dr. King said on the same topic. On the topic of light, Ella Baker said, "Give light and people will find a way. Give light and people will find a way." Dr. King said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And on the topic of freedom, Ella Baker said, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. That's why we can't wait. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." And Dr. King said, We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. It must be demanded by the oppressed. What does freedom mean today? And why can we not wait? Freedom today is the freedom to move safely without fear of violence or assault. Freedom today should be the freedom to cross a street without fear of being the victim of a racial slur. It should be the freedom to vote without fear of intimidation. It should be the freedom to speak without fear of retaliation. It should be the freedom to be without fear of erasure. And too often in today's society, those freedoms do not exist. That is why we can't wait. Thank you for joining us today, and let us resolve to move forward without waiting any longer to continue the important work of justice and freedom. Thank you.
My name is Cindy Flynn, and I'm a co-chair of the MLK Committee. Martin Luther King Jr. valued education and saw it as a means to help people succeed. Through the MLK scholarships, our youth are helped to go on to higher education. And it's through the generous donations of the people in the community that we have been able to award over $34,000 in scholarships since 1990. We greatly appreciate your support. This year's recipients are Allison Saul-Miller, and she will be attending the University of Cincinnati. Telaha McCullum will be attending The Ohio State University. And Amaya Rojas will be attending Ohio Wesleyan University. We'd like to congratulate all of the recipients, and again, we thank you greatly for all of your donations.
If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with word or song, if I can show somebody that he's traveling wrong, then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a good man ought, if I can bring back beauty to a world abroad, if I can spread love's message that the Master taught, then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be
definition is people realizing they are their own leaders. We are all a leader.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Nicole Jackson and I'm an Associate Professor of History at Bowling Green State University. It's my pleasure today to join you to talk about Diane Nash. So often, our understandings of the Civil Rights Movement privilege men, especially those with power and status like preachers, for instance. And we so often focus on the actions of adults that we often overlook that children and young adults can make history. But one of my favorite things about the Civil Rights Movement is that it involved everyone, of all genders, races, young and old, queer and straight, north, south, east, and west. The Civil Rights Movement was not just a moment in time, and for many of the people who lived through it, there are lessons they learned there that reverberated for the rest of their lives. In the aftermath of Dr. King's involvement in the Montgomery bus boycott, supporters across the world looked to him for inspiration and direction. And at home, Black youngsters, again children and young adults, saw him as a role model. They saw possibility in the successful, peaceful, and organized boycott, and they sought to apply the lessons learned in Montgomery to their own lives and their own cities. Children and young adults who participated in the Civil Rights Movement were sponges. They looked to their elders on the local, regional, national, and at times international stage. They learned from them, emulated them, and as is often the way of young people, they pushed the boundaries just a little bit further. One such person was Diane Nash. Diane Nash was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1938. She grew up Catholic, middle class, and in many ways sheltered from the everyday racism, or the everyday experiences of Jim Crow racism. It wasn't until she went to college, first at Howard University and then at Fisk University, that she experienced the petty, inconvenient, and eventually demoralizing effects of segregation. Nash didn't come from an activist family, and yet when faced with the realities of Black life in the American South, she was not cowed by it, she organized. It's all too easy to forget that activists are not born, they are made in community. While a student at Fisk, Nash joined civil disobedience workshops and student groups and eventually became a significant leader of the 1960 sit-ins that desegregated many public accommodations in the city of Nashville. At the time, she was 22. Much like the Montgomery boycott, sit-ins became a model for successful nonviolent action that spread across the country and later the world. In the aftermath of their successful movement, Nash and her compatriots set their sights on their next action because freedom could not wait. The community of students involved in sit-ins across the country met in the spring of 1960 at Shaw University to decide what their next actions should be. Understandably, they reached out to Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference for seeking whatever guidance he could offer. And in that action, they made the acquaintance of Ella Baker, SCLC secretary and longtime organizer. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Ella Baker so that we can understand Diane Nash just a little bit better. Ella Baker was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1903, the child of hardworking, working-class people and the granddaughter of the formerly enslaved. She grew up in a time and place that impressed upon her the supreme injustice of life for Black people. While in college, she too faced these injustices with action. She joined groups organized around issues of racial justice at home, like the Scottsboro case in 1931, and abroad, like Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Baker's life after college is the stuff of legend, and by that I mean she committed herself to organizing for freedom. She worked for the YWCA in Harlem. She was heavily involved in local New York politics across the city. She helped campaign and fundraise for progressive candidates who supported racial and economic equality. She was also a longtime field organizer for the NAACP. In this role, she traveled around the country helping set up new chapters and helping established chapters organize themselves and fundraise for their own local efforts. Baker believed that this work was vital in helping people to organize themselves. She placed little stock in national leadership. It was the people on the ground who could do the most good, she believed, who knew one another could care for their neighbors and band together when times were rough. Ella Baker believed in the people, not the organizations and not the leaders, the masses. So it should come as no surprise that Baker's advice to the students who contacted the SCLC was to remain autonomous, set their own goals, be their own leaders. Nor should we be surprised that she traveled to that first meeting to support the group, coincidentally held at her alma mater, Shaw University. Diane Nash met Ella Baker at that meeting and later came to consider her as a mentor, as many women and men in the movement. If they learned from Dr. King the value of nonviolent organizing, from Ms. Baker, they learned the value of practicing democracy and community building. The organization they've set up, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, joined members of the Congress of Racial Equality Corps in organizing and supporting the Freedom Rides, beginning in 1962. Later, the groups moved to Alabama to support voter registration in rural counties, places where few outsiders, white or black, dared to go, and where the press certainly did not move. The actions of SNCC and core organizers pushed people as disparate as Dr. King and President Kennedy to acknowledge the violence of the rural South with their direct action. They did not always agree with one another or their allies, but that is so often the way of change. I cannot overstate the sacrifice these young people like Diane Nash, many of whom, the sacrifices they made. Many of them, as I told you, were barely older than some of the people watching this video today. They were beaten, harassed, arrested, and feared assassination with cause, and they organized anyway. After the Civil Rights Movement, Nash moved back to Chicago to raise her children, where she lives to this day. She became a longtime organizer of teachers and in schools, also doing this work to this day. Nash's life, much like Ella Baker's, brought other people to the work of organizing, including her own mother and countless people after. For me personally, Diane Nash's work and life is an inspiration, a reminder to be of service, to hold your principles and your people dear, and to build community when and where you can. I hope you will seek her out and learn from the life that she is still living. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Hill.
And my name is Jasmine Hill. And this quote is from civil rights activist
Bayard Rustin. The real radical is that person who has a vision of equality
and is willing to do those things that will bring reality closer to that vision.
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. When an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him. These words are from one of the most important and influential civil rights organizers that you probably never heard of or heard little about, Mr. Bayard Rustin. Hello, my name is Tamika Vinson-Reid. I'm the chair of the African American Heritage Council. And over the next few minutes, I have the honor of highlighting this trailblazing visionary, tireless human activist, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s right-hand man, who was nearly written out of history. So let me paint the picture as to how all of this came to be. And to do that, we'll need to take a trip back onto that fateful day of December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, when Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery city bus. Following her arrest, Montgomery's Black leaders quickly organized to establish the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, and elected the then 26-year-old preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King, to lead what would become a 382-day bus boycott. 2 months into the boycott, people had been beaten and jailed. King's home had been bombed by this time. Racial tensions were at an all-time high, a boiling point. In February of 1956, Rustin came to observe one of the MIA meetings, and afterwards he wrote a very telling statement. As I watched the people walk away, I had a feeling that no force on earth could stop this movement. It has all the elements to touch the hearts of men. So Rustin, along with his mentor, labor organizer A. Philip Randolph, who was also the head of the first predominantly Black union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, paid a visit to King's home as they knew that fundamental changes had to be made in order for this boycott to be a success. During the visit, it was very clear to Rustin that King's view of nonviolent tactics was purely academic. You see, King had read about Gandhi, but truly hadn't embraced his pacifist principles as a way of life. And this was made clear to Rustin and Randolph as they approached King's home with armed guards, and there were guns everywhere in King's home. So after months of mentoring King, Rustin's indoctrination of the Gandhian principles, nonviolent resistance, and tactics of civil disobedience took hold. King recognized the brilliance of Rustin's strategies and organizational skills and invited him to serve as an advisor. He was also well aware of Rustin's background as a controversy, as a Black gay man to other civil rights leaders. As King's special assistant, Rustin assumed several roles, including proofreader, ghostwriter, philosophy teacher, and nonviolent strategist. But who was Bayard Rustin? Bayard Rustin was born on March 17, 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, to a single mother, but was raised by his grandparents, Jennifer and Julia Rustin. Rustin's lifelong commitment to nonviolence began with his Quaker upbringing and the influence of his grandmother, whose participation in the NAACP resulted in leaders of the Black community such as W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, and Mary McLeod Bethune visiting Rustin's home during his childhood. After graduating from Westchester High School, Rustin studied intermittently at Wilberforce University in Ohio on a music scholarship as he was an accomplished tenor vocalist. Rustin was active in a number of campus organizations, including Omega Psi Phi fraternity. He was expelled from Wilberforce in 1936 after organizing a strike. He then attended Cheyney State Teachers College, now known as Cheyney University of Pennsylvania, then moved to Harlem to attend City College of New York in 1937. So while at New York City College, he was briefly involved with the Young Communist League, but he quickly became disillusioned because of their shift against or away from civil rights, and so he quickly resigned. Shortly after his departure from that group, he was appointed youth organizer, and he was helping A. Philip Randolph with the proposed 1941 March on Washington. During this period, he also joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation, known as FOR, and he co-founded the Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE. Rustin organized campaigns and led workshops on nonviolent direct action for both organizations, serving as their field secretary and their racial relations director. As a declared pacifist, he refused induction into the military. Rustin, along with other members of the FOR and CORE organizations, were then convicted of violating the Selective Service Act. So from 1944 to 1946, Rustin was actually imprisoned in the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, where even there, he organized protests against segregated dining facilities. In 1947, Rustin was again arrested with other participants of CORE during the Journey of Reconciliation, which was a test of the ruling of the Supreme Court in the Morgan v. Commonwealth of Virginia case that banned racial discrimination and interstate travel as unconstitutional. So he was a pioneer in a sense, and this provided the early model for the Freedom Rides of 1961. After spending 22 brutal days on a North Carolina chain gang, Rustin published a report in several newspapers that led to the reform of prison chain gangs. Despite his tenure with FOR, Rustin was asked to resign from the organization in 1953 after his arrest and conviction on a public lewdness charge related to homosexual activity. He spent 60 days in a Pasadena, California jail. This was indeed the lowest point of his life because you see, the stigma of being gay was a heavy load to bear because he was never ashamed of his sexuality. However, others made it difficult for him to simply exist. But in 1956, history comes knocking, taking us back to the scene at King's home. So again, Rustin knew that in order for this boycott to work, Other places had to be better organized. So he proposed to King in December of 1956 that he create a group that would unite Black leaders in the South, and it would allow them to tie the masses of people so that their action projects were backed up basically by a broader base of people. And this helped create the foundation for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. Rustin developed the guidelines for the SCLC during their inaugural meeting in January of 1957. Alongside this, he also helped pen much of King's memoir, Stride Toward Freedom. But Rustin wouldn't allow himself to get credit for the book, telling an associate he didn't feel that he, King, should bear the burden. Rustin was instrumental in organizing the 1957 Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom. He authored several memos to King outlining the goals of the march and advised King on the topics he should cover in his address. With Randolph, he also coordinated the 1958 and 59 youth marches for integrated schools. So Rustin was a part of King's inner circle as the civil rights movement grew in the 1950s, but others considered him a liability. Tensions came to a head, and the worst fears of the civil rights activists were realized at the 1960 Democratic National Convention. Randolph, King, and Rustin had begun arrangements to march at the Democratic National Convention of presidential candidate John F. Kennedy and his running mate Lyndon B. Johnson in Los Angeles, protesting the party's lackluster position on civil rights. So in response, Democratic leadership sent Black Congressman Adam Clayton Powell to stop the march before it happened. And Powell used Rustin's sexual orientation as his weapon. So prior to the convention, Powell sent someone to threaten King, telling him that if they proceeded with the march, he would accuse King of having an affair with Rustin, not only killing the march, but dealing a possible fatal blow to the movement as a whole. So after consulting with his colleagues and advisors, King decided to distance himself from Rustin. Rustin's reluctant resignation from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference marked one of the few times that King actually lost the battle to fear. In response to Powell's threat, King's team made a counter threat, and it worked, and cleared the way for King to protest the 1960 Democratic Convention with Rustin as the sole casualty. However, Rustin's brilliance could not be denied. In 1963, A. Philip Randolph began organizing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom with several other civil rights leaders. Despite the concerns of those leaders, Rustin was appointed deputy director of the march. And in less than 2 months, Rustin guided the organization of the event that would bring over 200,000 participants to the nation's capital. Rustin took over a rundown office in Harlem with a small staff and got to work. Within days, he had raised $15,000 to bring poor people to Washington. He drafted the mission statement for the march, designed the plan for security, contracted with bus companies to transport marchers, arranged for 1,000 beds to be made available the night before, and enlisted hundreds of volunteers to make bag lunches for those who didn't bring food. Rustin organized this march without cell phones, emails, and faxes. Imagine that. He became known as Mr. March on Washington. So while King spoke as the face of the civil rights movement on the morning of August 28, 1963, with his seminal I Have a Dream speech, it was Rustin who stood behind the scenes, an indispensable force within the movement. He was a man whose life was shaped by the very prejudices the movement fought against, not only because of his race, but because he was gay. During the day, Rustin was not on the official program, but he did take the podium to list the 10 demands from the march. And it was the march that gave widespread publicity and political impetus to the then pending civil rights legislation, a version of which President Lyndon B. Johnson signed on July 2nd, 1964. From 1965 to 1979, Rustin served as president and later co-chair of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, an organization for Black trade unionists dedicated to racial equality and economic justice. From this position, Rustin promoted his view for future progress for African Americans, which rested on the alliance between Blacks, liberals, labor, and religious groups. Rustin didn't engage in any gay rights activism until the 1980s. He testified on behalf of the New York State's gay rights bill, which was his final victory. Rustin said, in quote, "It occurred to me shortly after that it was absolutely necessary for me to declare homosexuality, because if I didn't, I was part of the prejudice." He continued to say, "I was aiding and abetting the prejudice that was part of the effort to destroy me." Rustin died on August 24th, 1987, but his fight for nonviolence lived on among countless people inspired by the 1963 March on Washington. In 2013, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded Rustin the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his unyielding career in civil rights activism. President Obama asserted that he would not have ascended to the highest office in the land had it not been for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But I submit to you today that there would not have been a Dr. King without a Bayard Rustin. So today, we must continue to take up the mantle of Rustin, who laid the groundwork for speaking truth to power. He showed us that we can be enraged by injustice, but we cannot allow it to destroy us. As long as injustice exists, we cannot walk alone, and we cannot wait.
We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is time for vigorous and positive actions.
Well, grace and peace, brothers and sisters. I'm Dr. Charles Montgomery, and I'm just so deliciously delighted to be able to come before you today. Let me express my appreciation to Dr. Rob Jones and the Ohio Wesleyan community family. I want to also thank Ms. Pamela Foster and Sister Cindy Finn, who skillfully co-chair this MLK Celebration Committee, and also to Brother Jason Timpson and the wonderful people of the Multicultural Student Affairs Office for your gracious invitation. Indeed, it is a privilege to take just a few moments of your time to share some words on behalf, or I should say in honor, of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Before I do that, allow me to give a shout out to Dr. Nicole Jackson and Sister Tamika Vinson-Reid, who have already done such an excellent job at this point. It's just really pretty much made my talk pretty easy. In fact, I like to begin, like I do with most of my remarks, by something pretty simple. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I don't know how many of you all have ever looked at that poem closely, but it's deep. Because if you think the poem was really about Humpty Dumpty, then you've missed it. But the poem is really about all the king's horses and all the king's men. You see, it is where Humpty Dumpty went for his help that is the issue of the poem. But the tragedy of the poem is that the best that the land had, all the king's horses and all the king's men, could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So do you know what that tells us? That tells us not only was Humpty Dumpty, but all the king's horses and all the king's men were just as Humpty Dumpty was. And don't you know that's exactly one of the world's biggest problems? Not only the people who are messed up, but we have the people who are supposed to be able to fix up the messed up people, and they're just as messed up as the people they're trying to fix up. So we really have a bunch of Humpty Dumpty people living in a Humpty Dumpty world. And what this world needs is a group of people who can kind of stand up and rise up and accept the baton of their day. To show the world that there really is a better way, a way not to just be so much embroiled in chaos, but embracing what Dr. King called beloved community. What is beloved community? Beloved community, I believe, are groups of people committed to the philosophy of reconciliation so that a broken world can be restored to what God originally intended. That is a world in harmony with God and in harmony with one another. That's beloved community. If you haven't daydreamed on me, I believe I said that they are groups of committed people. Because on days like this, Dr. King might get a lot of accolades. But the truth be told, Dr. King didn't do all that he did alone. In fact, the success of the civil rights movement was because of the efforts of a community of people, a community that consisted of young people like Claudette Colvin, who made a decision to sit down so that we could stand up years before Rosa Parks did. Like the late Representative John Lewis, who even then didn't hesitate in getting involved in some good trouble. And of course, the great Diane Nash, you heard about her earlier, who's at the vanguard of freedom rides and sit-ins, and so committed to freedom that when they threatened to throw her in jail, she in that young spirit said, "I'll stay in jail without the bail." Civil rights movement, you see, was filled with young people who were committed to a philosophy of reconciliation. In fact, what's overlooked by so many is how Dr. King was young himself in that movement. Remember, he was 15 years old when he finished high school, 19 years old when he graduated from my alma mater, Morehouse College, 26 years old when he graduated from Crozier Theological Seminary and started pastoring the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and even heading the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. In 26 years, he had already decided he was going to make a difference. And that's why I applaud Ohio Wesleyan for having events like this, not just for the scholarship, but to platform these young people. I'd be remiss if I didn't call their names. Allison Sawmiller, Talisha McCullum, Amaya Rojas, they represent generations. And this generation, let this world know that there are exactly groups of young people who are committed and who are serious. And that's important because it sends a message to a world that says you're not serious or sane, sober or sensitive. They say you're not concerned or committed, interested or involved. They say that this generation spends more time and they're more concerned with having high top tennis shoes. They've got low ambition. Airbrush fingernails, but stained glass identities. They have more concern about the tattoos on their body than they do about having the word of God in their heart, a word that compels them to make a difference. But not only did Martin have young people around him who made a difference, he surrounded himself with seasoned sages that made a difference. But if we're going to have a beloved community, we need some folk who are seasoned. Some of you don't get mad, I didn't call you old, but I'm calling for folk who are seasoned. In fact, if you live long enough, you'll learn to appreciate good seasoning. In fact, let me prove it to you. You ever had some fried chicken or a piece of fried chicken with no seasoning? Chances are, if you did, you wouldn't want a second bite. Because the first bite lets you know it wasn't worth much. You see, what made Dr. King so great, and dare I say worth his salt, was the seasoning he had in him. He had the seasoning from Daddy King and from Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, from the mystic Dr. Howard Thurman. He had the seasoning of all of those folk before he even spoke about a dream. In fact, let me let you in on a little secret. Dr. King wasn't actually the first person to talk about a dream for America. He first heard the dream articulated by a fellow preacher, and her name was Prathia Hall. And she talked about a dream with such persuasive profundity that Dr. King couldn't help but pack it in his heart. So much so as he gave that famous speech, "I have a dream." No, in the middle of the dream, in the middle of the speech, it was really extemporaneous, and somebody shouted from the crowd, I believe it was Mahalia Jackson. She said, tell America about the dream. And Martin King, when he heard that, simply unpacked what was already in his heart, placed in there by a seasoned sage. I tell you, we ought to appreciate good seasoning and the value of seasoned sages who have gone before us, helped us to build beloved community. Martin King knew And he was smart enough to know that if he was going to build a beloved community, he needed seasoned sages, but he also needed an architect. His name was Bayard Rustin. That's why we're so intentional in moments like this. And that's why we mentioned him earlier. Because Bay Rustin was a cultural architect for the movement. And if you know anything about cultural architects, they help us to shape and place and frame critical moments. In fact, I would suggest in the critical moments we are right now facing, that we need more cultural architects to help us to understand the moment, but then also how to shape the moment. Quickly, let me show you what I mean. In 2022, we have at least three forces that conspire to break our community. Force number one is this: polarization caused by fear. Because the reality in our world, in our communities, in our cities, and in our tribes, in many cases, they're becoming polarized. And one of the reasons why polarization occurs is really because of fear. And this fear causes people to want to run to their corner, because when they do that, it helps them to feel safe. And when you feel safe within your own group or your own kind, whatever that looks like, whether it's your race or your ethnicity or your tribe, you can relax. And then you can say the word that you really want to say. And you can express how you really want to feel, because you are in a safe space where there is, at least in your mind, no judgment. But the problem of remaining in a safe space is that you rarely engage beyond your own community. So you stay in your own corner because you're polarized by fear. But there's a second force we have to deal with, and that is politics that are fueled by anger. That's when people come out of their corners to engage with the culture because they're angry about elements of the culture, so much so that they want to change it. And one of the ways they try to change it is by becoming involved in the political process. Here's the problem. If I'm polarized by fear, then when I come out of my proverbial corner and I engage in politics, I now, because I'm fueled by my anger, I'm going to make decisions trying to keep my polarization or my fear protected. Meaning this: I'll engage in political community, but my engagement is all about protecting the polarized group that I represent. In other words, when people are politicized by anger, their involvement more often than not is in the interest of protecting themselves and the ones they represent from the very thing that they have been fearing. And when you mix up all of that anger and all that fear, you create the potential for emotionally combustible situations. That's what we're witnessing even now in America, as we continue to see passions boiling and emotions all over the place. And that's really what the third force is: a radicalization inflamed by injustice. You see, when I think about radicalization, I think of people who are emboldened to act. See, now, because I feel an injustice, I feel emboldened to act. With polarization, I'm afraid, so I just go hang out with my own people. With politicization, I get involved because I'm angry. But with radicalization, I feel emboldened to act. And at this point, it's right to me. And I don't care if it's right to you. It's an injustice that I perceive. And when I become radicalized, something goes off in my brain and I don't care anymore. And so I'll do whatever I have to do to get the justice that I demand, even if that means I've got to resort to violence and take up arms, or protest about wearing a mask, or organize my own march on Washington, try to take over the Capitol. I'll do whatever I have to do to be noticed, to let the system know and those in power know that my life and my perception matters. My friends, that's what's happening. And these three tensions pull at the fabric of our culture, creating chasms that need to be bridged by cultural architects who are courageous enough to show that there is a better way. And that way is beloved community. Here's a question I want you to consider. How do you shape beloved community? Well, you must understand that beloved community innately is shaped by love. That tells me there is a connection between loving God and showing love toward one another. In fact, if you'd allow me to be a preacher for a moment, because that's what I am. Some of you remember over in Luke chapter 10, there's a lawyer that rises and asks Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus comes back and says, what does the law say? The lawyer says, thou shalt love the Lord your God with all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, that's right. But then the lawyer says, who is my neighbor? And then as Dr. King says, Jesus immediately pulled his question from midair and placed it on a dangerous curve between Jerusalem and Jericho. And he talked about a certain man who fell among thieves. Remember, if you know the story, a Levite passed by on the other side, didn't stop to help him. And then there was another person of another race. Well, there was another person that stopped by and saw him fall, and he didn't stop to help him as well. But there was another man of another race that came by, got down from his beast, decided not to be compassionate by proxy, but instead he got involved and treated this man of another race as his neighbor. Friends, I believe there are some things I think we can glean from this story and apply if we really want to create beloved community. First, I think we've got to see difference as a doorway to dialogue. You see, when this man saw somebody of a different race in distress, he did not say what will happen to him. Instead, he said, if I don't try to help. Well, I should say this. Let me put it like this. When he saw a man of a different race in distress, he didn't say what will happen to me. But instead, he said, if I don't try to help, what's going to happen to him? Notice the dialogue that occurs inside. He doesn't simply see the man and pass by. He's not so religious that he resists being in relationship. Why? Because there's dialogue going on the inside. Can I ask you a question? When you see people who are different from you in distress, what's the dialogue that happens inside of you? Or better yet, what captures your attention? When you see people different from you who are hurting, do you flip the channel? Or just turn or click away? Or is God calling you to authentically engage or humbly listen? It is true that riots are the language of the unheard. So in your lifestyle, what are the things that you and I need to do to listen to people who are different from us? If you're on Facebook, chances are you have a Facebook page, Instagram or Twitter or even TikTok. You're following somebody else. But who are your friends? Who do you follow? How many are different from you? Your ethnicity, your race, your viewpoint, your ideologies. Do you have a variety of relationships? But then secondly, there's a second force. And that is what we got to do to build beloved community. We've got to see distance as a barrier to peace. You see, one of the dangers of distance is that distance demonizes. I think of that African proverb. When I was afar, I thought he was a monster. When he got closer, I thought he was an animal. When he got closer, I thought he was a human being. But when we were face to face, I realized that he was my brother. Distance demonizes, trying to get us to deny the imago Dei in one another, to get us to deny that all of us are made in the image of God. In fact, that's what allows racism and sexism and tribalism and colonialism and any other ism to exist. Because if I can deny God's image upon you, then I can deny the humanity of you. And if I can deny the humanity of you, that leads me to believe that I'm better than you. And watch this, pass policies and regulations to undermine you and discriminate against you, and in some cases, dominate you and believe that I'm justified in because I have a lifestyle of maintaining distance from really getting to know you and people like you. But this Samaritan doesn't maintain his distance. Instead, he gets off his beast of burden and intentionally gets in proximity with this man. In other words, he closes the gap by beginning to identify with this man's pain. Because when we understand each other's situation, we become candidates to make meaningful contributions. Why is that important? Because if we want to build beloved community, we use difference as a doorway to dialogue. We see distance as a barrier of peace, but we also have to do something for justice. Because watch this, this Samaritan not only had a dialogue with himself and closed distance between he and another person of a different race, but he dressed his wounds and dedicated resources towards him being restored. Meaning this, he exercised mercy and he exercised justice. If we want to be serious about community, we've got to be serious about justice. How do you show justice? Just like the Samaritan, you start where you are, you use what you have, and you do what you can to do what Cornel West calls love out loud. You love someone if they're old, you love them if they're young. You love them if they're Black, you love them if they're white. You love them if they're Native American, you love them if they're Hispanic American. You love them if they're queer, you love them if they're Quaker. You love them if they're African, you love them if they're Asian. You love them because God loves you and you're called to do that. And when you do that, you help us to build beloved community. Now, there are some who say that it's easier said than done. But the Bible infers that sometimes God uses the simple to confound the wise. Sometimes building beloved community is simple. See, I started out with something simple. Well, let me close with something simple as well. To build beloved community, sometimes as simple as ABC. You take the A and accept your challenge. With the B, you believe in yourself. With the C, you combine your words with action. With the D, you dedicate your life to your dreams. With the E, you expect some hard times. With the F, you fight on and you're faithful and you finish your course. You take the G and get God on your side. With the H, have a made up mind. Take that I and inspire somebody else. With the J, journey with Jesus by your side. Take that K and keep on keeping on. With the L, let love be the light to show the way. With that M and make every day count. With the N, never say I can't. Take that O and overcome your obstacles. With the P, put your best foot forward. With the Q, quit quitting. With the R, run the race with patience. With the S, stand strong. With the T, trust the Lord. With the U, use your talents. With the V, value your time. With the W, work until your work is done. And with the X, x-ray your own lifestyle. With the Y, yearn to achieve all the goals you seek. And with the Z, zealously strive to reach your peak. God bless you. We shall overcome.
As we close today's celebration, I would invite you into a moment of prayer. While I offer this prayer as a Christian chaplain, I invite you to join me however your tradition indicates. If you call no tradition your own, then I invite you to join me in a moment of reflection. As we go from this place, may we roar with the justice that rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. May we carry within us the courage of the kitchen fires that behind the scenes have seen a movement fed. May we taste the air of the beloved community and breathe its reality out into the world with every breath we give. May we feel beneath our feet the rock-steady foundation of those who have come before, both sung and unsung, remembered and forgotten. As we move in this time, may love break down the walls of apathy. May truth burst the bubble of lies and naivete. May joy dissolve the corrosion of hatred. May wisdom brace us to resist all evil without picking up the tools of the oppressor. As we commit once more to this work, may it be now that racism crumbles. May it be now that injustice ceases. May it be now that the dream emerges as more than just a dream. May it be now. Amen.
Greetings. I'm Jason Timpson, the Director of the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs at Ohio Wesleyan University. Thank you for joining Delaware County's 29th Annual Martin Luther King Day Celebration. Whether you are joining us via live broadcast or watching the recording at a later time, we appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this community who is driven toward justice. This year, the Delaware County MLK Committee has added some features that I'm sure you noticed. Shout out to all the kids who shared quotes from civil rights leaders. We know that while Dr. King was seen as a figurehead of the civil rights movement, he didn't do it alone. Our goal this year was to highlight that he was in community with others. Earlier in the broadcast, you heard about the contributions of two of those leaders, Diane Nash and Bayard Rustin. The importance of having our youth as a part of the Delaware County MLK program is to highlight that children are active parts of the civil rights movement. School integrations, sit-ins, the Children's Crusade, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing are all examples to highlight that children were and still are active parts of the civil rights movement. In 1964, Dr. King wrote Why We Can't Wait about the nonviolent movement against racial segregation in the United States, and specifically the 1963 Birmingham campaign. In 2022, we should have that same passion. We can't wait. We are seekers of justice. So my question to you is, how will you push for justice for all? What baton will you pick up? Is that the push for gender justice, economic justice, matters regarding food, housing, community needs, reproductive rights, trans rights, disability rights, racial justice, or others? Scholar Deepa Iyer has created a framework to help those who are seekers of justice. If you Google social change ecosystem, you will find a model to help you figure out where you fit in the fight for justice. You might be a disruptor, one who is speaking up and taking action, a caregiver, somebody who's providing nourishment, support, love, and creating a future of care. You could be a storyteller or an artist, somebody who's documenting and highlighting our move toward justice. Whatever role you find yourself in, remember that there is always space to do what's right. All right, so now to the thanks. Special thanks to all those who purchased tickets for the Scholarship Fund, and a heartfelt thank you for everybody who made this event possible. Those folks who worked to create an in-person event and then who worked to create a virtual pivot. Shout out to our speakers, our talented youth, the interns in the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, the chaplain's office at OWU, the Dean of Student Support Staff at Ohio Wesleyan, and last but absolutely not least, the Delaware County MLK Committee. Those folks are Reverend Dr. Amy Anderson, Deborah Lipscomb, Don Chisebe, and co-chairs Cindy Flynn and Pamela Foster. So, as you remember your work toward justice, you also should remember to incorporate fun and joy into the mix as well. We'll see you back here in 2023 for our 30th annual MLK Day Celebration. See you soon.